You're listening to the Sex and Psychology Podcast, the sex ed you never got in school and won't get anywhere else. I am your host, Dr. Justin Lehmiller. I am a social psychologist and research fellow at the Kinsey Institute and author of the book, Tell Me What You Want, The Science of Sexual Desire and How It Can Help You Improve Your Sex Life. Who are you as a sexual person? For a lot of people, the way they answer this question might involve stating their sexual identity label, or perhaps talking about the kinds of sexual activities that they enjoy in the bedroom, such as kink. And while those are perfectly valid answers, they really only scratch the surface of who we are as sexual beings. Human sexuality is complex and multifaceted. In today's show, we're going to teach you a new way of thinking about sex by introducing you to the concept of holistic sexuality. We're going to describe what holistic sexuality is and how it's different from the way that most of us have been taught to think about sex. We're also going to dive into some of the key facets of holistic sexuality that are crucial to know for both purposes of self-understanding and building up your sexual agency. I am joined today by Dr. Juliana Hauser, a licensed marriage and family therapist and licensed professional counselor who specializes in relationships, sex, and sexuality. In addition to running a successful virtual private practice, Dr. Juliana is a nationally known expert in this area whose work has appeared all over in the media. She is also the author of the newly released book, A New Position on Sex, a guide to greater sexual confidence, pleasure, and authenticity. This is going to be another fascinating conversation that you won't want to miss. Hi, Juliana, and welcome back to the show.
So good to see you.
Thanks so much for joining me. So you have a new book out called A New Position on Sex, which is a fun title, by the way. So tell us the brief story behind this book. What was your goal in writing it, and why do you think it's time for us to take a new position on sex?
The first part is I wanted to be able to have my work reach a larger audience because there's just one of me. And I had a student one time say, this shouldn't just stay at a university. This is something that we should be doing across, especially the US, but across the world. So I started the process of writing it. Through it, I really realized that I wanted it to be something that felt really interactive. And I wanted the book itself to be something that replicates what the content is and risk sharing and exercises and prompts. One of the goals is that I just want the work to be accessible. And one of the things I want people to gain from it is I want to change the conversation that we're having right now about what sexuality is. We go back and forth through the decades of this, and I know through our work too, we've seen a whole lot of changes and also a lot of things that are staying the same too. And I'm hoping this book can be a conversation changer for our sexual culture. And one way that I look at it is that, and I'm so grateful for the change of access to information in general. But I feel like there's a part of it missing in the conversation that is more the foundational part of who we are as sexual beings. And a lot of times people are starting at like what I would consider the addict, which is like the sex tips, which is wonderful and really important. But if you're building the addict before you're building the foundation, then you're really missing a lot. And with this book, I'm hoping that it helps with the unlearning of things that we need to let go of. And it gives a framework in which to begin answering the question, who am I as a sexual being?
Yeah, I love that approach. And, I think you're so right that a lot of people, when it comes to addressing problems in their intimate life, they're kind of looking for the quick fix, the Band-Aid solution, what is this one tip or thing that I can do that's, magically going to change my sex life? But it's more complicated than that. And, that's also why people go into sex therapy. It's because they need to do that work on the foundation and really understand themselves as a sexual being. And so I like that you've created a resource here that anybody can read to try and do a lot of that work that you would do in a therapy office.
Yes. And it's overwhelming. It's something that where do I begin? So if you do believe that it's worthy to spend time in who you are as a sexual being, which I want everyone to believe, then often the next step is, well, where do I begin? And that's one of the answers that I wanted to give to everybody. And then also just, I'm sure you know this too, that the circles of sexuality that we were taught in our education, and that still is really, when you Google, it comes up very, very quickly. I find it to be really outdated. A beautiful beginning, a revolutionary in 1981, but it's really just not relevant in a lot of ways to where we are now. So I'm really hoping that the 9 pillars of sexuality that I've worked with will be a helpful replacement of that.
So, your book is all about this concept of holistic sexuality, which you describe as being sort of the final frontier in self development. So, help us to better understand what you mean by holistic sexuality. How is this different from the way that most of us have been taught to think about sex? And what are the benefits of looking at sex through this more holistic view?
When I started my work as a therapist, I was so surprised that I didn't get any formalized education about sex and sexuality, especially when I knew I was going to be working with couples. And that was even coming from a place of being really relationship focused in sexuality. And I was still such a novice in understanding the greater depth of what sexuality could mean. So when I started doing the work, I had to really search for it on my own. It wasn't going to be handed to me. At the time, it felt hard, but it really ended up being a gift because I got to really ask myself the questions like, well, what is it that I'm looking for? What is sexuality? Which is where I want everyone to begin. And my answer to that is going to be a different version to perhaps yours or to everyone else's, which at first felt like a problem. Now it feels like that's the beauty of it, is that there's flexibility within what sexuality is. But when I ask people, most people begin with either something that's related to sex acts or something related to sexual orientation, which is both things are very important to who we are as holistic sexual beings, but they're not the only things. And I knew that instinctively. And then I went out to research it. And after 20 years of asking questions and taking stories for people, I started seeing that when you do the work of knowing who you are as a sexual being and understand that that's a necessity, not a luxury, then you're really doing a view of who you are as a whole person and the skills that you grow in examining who you are as a sexual being are skills that help you with your mental health, that help you with your overall wellness because sexuality is complicated and there are so many angles to it that are put upon us by other people and cultures and politics. And so to have the bravery to ask yourself, is that right for me? Is that who I am? Is that what I believe? Is that what I know about myself? You have the skill to ask the question and the bravery to answer it on your own requires that you have a deep knowledge of yourself. And so for me, holistic sexuality is both the essence of who we are and also a pathway to the core of who we are.
Yeah, I like that. And when I think about sexuality, like, for example, thinking about it in the context of gay men, like I know so many gay men who just identify as a sexual position, right? Like they're a top or a bottom or a side or versatile. And it's like, are you just a position, right? Isn't there more to your sexuality than that? And your position preferences are part of what you might like and enjoy when it comes to sex, but that's not necessarily at the core of who we are as sexual beings. And, I'm not just saying that specifically for gay men, but for everybody. Like we've often not done the work to kind of figure out who we are, what we really want, what our core erotic themes are. And so that's one of the things I like about your work is thinking about sex through this broader lens beyond just the specific sex acts or positions that we might engage in.
I really do have understanding as to how we became so reductive. Sexuality is complicated and it's not a safe space for a lot of us to talk about or explore, and we're not getting a lot of language for it. So we do end up putting names to things and keeping it in a pretty neat box for us, regardless of what those words end up being. And it's hard to veer out of that. But the benefit of doing it is when you know who you are, just in general, when you know who you are, then you really get to offer yourself in such an authentic way to your connections. And the connections can be different. It can be a sexual connection. It can be a friendship, work, whatever it is. But I get to show up and offer myself to you in the truth. And then one of the wonderful benefits that we don't talk enough about is because I'm showing up to you authentically, because I've done the work to figure out who I am, which is ever changing. Then if you are saying, yeah, Juliana, I'd like to get to know you, or yes, I'd like you on my podcast, or yes, whatever the yes is, then I get to receive it authentically, which is a much deeper kind of connection. And as a therapist, it's something that I see so many humans really needing. And it's why like the phrase, I'm in a room full of people or I have a house full of people, but I feel so alone. Or the loneliest place to be is in bed with somebody that you're not connected with. To me, I think some of the answer of it is really doing that in-depth work. And it's where my work as a sex educator and as a therapist overlap. And when that kind of connected for me years ago, I thought, right, it's one of the last places I went to know who I was. And I know it's for a lot of us, it's one of the last places. And when you cross over there and take the reduction out of the equation, it just changes everything. And it's not just about having great sex, which is fabulous, and I'm a huge fan. I'm really talking about really feeling different in your own skin on your own terms.
Makes total sense. And, I also understand why people are sometimes reluctant to do the work because it can be a little bit scary to kind of go that deep. And so, yeah, I get it. Your relationship isn't broken. Your sex life just needs a reboot. In long-term relationships, it's common for partners to lose the spark. Intimacy can start feeling less like passion and more like a checklist. I know firsthand because this has happened to me before. But the good news is that I also know that things can change. And Beducated has been an enormously helpful tool. Beducated is an online resource featuring more than 100 courses created by the world's top experts that can help you to bring the spice back into the bedroom. For example, check out their course called Sexperiments for Couples. It's just what you need if you're looking to break the routines and bring some fun, play, and excitement back into the bedroom. You'll learn how to introduce elements of sexual surprise that can get you and your partner out of your head and into your body and bring that sense of mystery back into your relationship that really fuels those feelings of passion. That's one of the things I really love about this course because it gives you concrete tools and inspiration that you need in order to start having unforgettable sex again. Say goodbye to your dormant sex life and hello to a sex life reboot with Beducated. Beducated is where toe-curling pleasure meets expert-backed education. Get 50% off the yearly pass by using my last name, Laymiller, as the coupon code. Try Beducated risk-free with a 14-day money-back guarantee. If you want to transform the way you describe your sex life from "it's okay" to "I can't wait for tonight," Beducated is just what you need. Check the show notes for the link and be sure to use my last name to get your discount. So something you talk about in the book are these 9 pillars of holistic sexuality. So let's walk through some of them. The first is what you call sensuality. Now, when people hear the term sensual, it's one that probably brings lots of different things to mind for different people. So explain to us what you mean by the term sensuality and why it's so crucial to our sexuality.
Yes. So it's the first one. And through the years, I've had different orders of how I put the topics or how I would run people through in my course. In sensuality, it was undeniable it had to be first. And it wasn't because it was an easy one, quote, easy. Nothing about sexuality is easy.
Nope.
But because a lot of people say, well, I'm not a sensual person, especially if they describe themselves as no nonsense or type A or whatever it is. And they always thought that they had to be someone in Bali and, all the things. And when I was like, no, the definition is your senses. And everyone has different access to a different amount of senses. But in general, we have access to some of them. And when that clicks on a deeper level, like, I am a sensual being based on my access to how many senses I have access to on my own terms, it's one of the first acts of agency that you get to really move into as a sexual being. And that light bulb just clicks on, and it's just a beautiful place to start asking yourself, is this a yes or is this a no? Do I find pleasure in this? Does this sense like this thing being attached to it or exposed to it? And the amount of change that I see in people when they embrace sensuality and understand that it's not synonymous with sexuality, it's its own part and aspect of it. It's amazing. And it's accessible for us. It is one of those places that we just inherently have, again, some level of access to. So when some people will say, well, this, sexuality isn't for me, sensuality is a beautiful example of, yes, it is. And you get to decide what that means for you. So it's the access to your senses, and it's your yes and no's within each of the senses that you have access to.
So you talk about how it's important for us to explore our sensuality and to figure out your sensuality style in order to develop sexual agency. So how do we do that? Can you walk us through an exercise and how we might awaken our sensuality and kind of figure out what our style is?
Yes. So I love doing a touch exercise that you can do in different parts of your body, but I love beginning here on our forearm. And there's different touches and I've taken it from some tantric training. So it's not original to me. The wording isn't original, but there's different levels of touch and different movements to it. So the first one is air, and air is something that is like just really kind of gently touching it. And it's pretty slow. So almost if you were to close your eyes, then you could feel like the presence and maybe the heat every once in a while kind of touching up against it. The next is water. So water has that you actually are touching, but it has movement to it. So there's a change on your skin that has some lightness to it. And there's earth, which is like if you were to have a massage and they say, do you like it firm? Earth is firm. So like you're putting an indentation and there has just like some grounding to it. And the last is fire, which would be slapping or pinching. And it's more unexpected and it has different levels of intensity to it. So you do those 4 touches to your body. You start anywhere, but I'm starting on my forearm and you sit into it. So that when I first started doing this, earth was my yum. It was like, yes, like just give it to me. Earth everywhere. And air was like, oh, no. And I remember doing it next to somebody else who was like, earth was really off-putting to them and air was their favorite. And I remember we looked at each other like, whoa. And then we walked through, they're like, wow. In a split second, I went from feeling really excited that I had an answer to what was a yum and what was a yuck to me to, oh, wow, I'm different than somebody else. And this quick like judgment of like, am I wrong? Or are they wrong? Why did I go to wrong? Why can't we both celebrate this thing? And then to curiosity of, oh, how cool. Like, oh, right. The world doesn't revolve around what I think is a yuck and a yum. Not everyone is like me. Isn't that amazing? And don't I need to know that with the people that I'm connecting with, whether it's something that I'm touching or someone else? And all of that happened within 10 seconds. And the power of that and the lessons that you take, even from just that quick exercise, can be extrapolated to so many other parts of the other pillars, as well as other parts of who you are as a sexual being. You do that at one body part, you start adding it to others. And it's what you like on your head may be different than what you like on your genitals, different on your feet, versus what you like to give versus what you want to receive. There's just so much that you can do with it. So that one example, touch in your sensual beings.
Yeah, it's a fun exercise that you can do on your own to sort of better understand yourself, but you can also do it with a partner to better understand them and the kinds of touch that they like to receive. And, you can also do these kinds of exercises, not just for touch as a sensory sense, but also for, what is it that you like to see or hear during sex as well? Because, we're all different sexual beings when it comes to the sensory inputs that we like to receive. And, some people are hypersensitive in certain ways and other people are hyposensitive. And so it's really about just kind of understanding who you are and who your partner or partners are so that you can connect more deeply and everybody gets the kind of stimulation that they desire.
Yes. And when you start stacking pleasure upon pleasure of things that it really can open up your experience in arousal, your experience with desire, your experience with pleasure. And I don't think we talk enough about how to stack that upon our sexual experiences, either with ourselves or you said like with other people. I had a client that I worked with who, when we first met, she said, oh, I'm definitely not a sensual person. And she actually refused to start with sensuality when we were doing our work together. I was like, okay, great. It's your no for right now. We'll get back to it. And by the end, she said it was her scariest one because she felt so far away from being a sensual person and hadn't been described as that from other people. But when we open it up, and for her, touch ended up being the most powerfully potent information place for her. I had her have rope. I had her touch all sorts of different kind of textures on her skin. And she realized like she liked this one certain kind of like fake fur that she had. And she realized that was the biggest yum she had. She looked around her place and realized she had it everywhere and she had never noticed. And she had this moment that, again, it may sound small, but it really isn't. She's like, I did have body knowledge. I did know who I was. And I just never put the pieces together. And so just by this fake fur experience, it wasn't so much about learning that she liked that texture on her skin. It was her saying, I knew this all along. And she grieved a kind of like a self-abandonment, but then she got to celebrate. I had wisdom. And then everything opened up again. And we ended up, she got so excited. We went through all the pillars again because she felt like she had a different lens of competence. I think that's what can happen in these pillars too, is that you can gain a different level of sexual competence that the world doesn't always give us.
So true. Are you tired of navigating the confusing and, let's be honest, sketchy world of libido supplements? You're not alone. There are tons of libido products on the market that make big promises, but finding one that actually lives up to the hype is a tall order because many of the options out there contain questionable ingredients or they're underdosed or ineffective. But what if there was a libido booster you could actually trust? Let me introduce you to Drive Boost from VB Health. Drive Boost is different. VB Health is built on trust and transparency. Their formula isn't a mystery. It's doctor-formulated, third-party tested for purity and potency, and proudly made here in the USA. And here's something else that makes Drive Boost unique. It's designed for both men and women. So if you're ready to ditch the shady stuff and choose a libido supplement that's effective and that you can feel confident about, it's time to check out Drive Boost. Learn more and get yours at vb.health. Visit vb.health and use code Justin for 10% off or click the link in the show notes. So another pillar of sexual agency has to do with how we understand and feel about our own bodies. So many of us don't even know basic information about the human body and how it changes over time, and also how that relates to sexual health and well-being. And a big part of the reason for this is because when most of us get sex ed, if we get it at all, it's right around the time of puberty. And we really only learn about how our bodies are going to change at that point. But our bodies continue to evolve from there. And when we start experiencing things like menopause or andropause, we can feel totally unprepared for it because no one ever taught us about those things or what to expect. So talk to us a little bit about how really understanding our bodies, especially as we age, is so important for sexual agency and well-being.
I think you and I could probably talk for 4 hours about the problems with our sex education and say the same things back and forth to each other, like, yes, yes, yes. And it's all true and valid. And one of the things that often gets left off the list of what's wrong with our sex education is that it doesn't span our lifespan. Mm-hmm. And even 20 years ago when I started this work, I didn't even realize, I just had like an ageism to me in looking at sexuality. I didn't realize how important it was for me to understand it. And I was lucky enough to be close with Betty Dotson. And I never forget one of my first circles that I did with her. She's like, who wants to see an 80-year-old vulva? And, and I was like, I do. And I remember when she showed us in the body sex circle, and it wasn't that she was just presenting us with her vulva. She was saying, look at my aged vulva. And it was fascinating wording to me. It was such an interesting thing. And I know that's not for everybody out there, and that's not going to be, a lot of people's pathways. But what it did for me is reflect. I hadn't at that point even had a visual of what that looked like. And I had seen in pornography aged penises, but I hadn't seen an aged vulva. And what that loss did for me in my own education on my own body was really interesting to see and to experience and then to get curious about myself. It took me really late in life to even know that pubic hair turned gray. And now it's like, wow, I cannot believe it took me that long to understand that. And why that's important is we already have such a complicated relationship with our bodies. All of us do, all genders do. And you add sexuality on top of that. And we look at how our genitals change in color and shape. And if you're not walking into the aging process, which we are as soon as we're born, we're aging, we add so many layers to our distance between what we want to feel about our body and our relationship with it to where we really are. And ageism becomes self-inflicted. So that's an issue, let alone just the nuts and bolts of, I do a lot in the menopause space, and I've had to really self-educate along the way because even though, we know that a lot of people outside of a very specific sexuality training, if you're just a general therapist, you're not giving any education, you are absolutely getting zero education on menopause. So I had to learn a lot. I had a hysterectomy a year ago, and I am a sex expert. I am an expert in menopause, and I still had little information about what was going to happen to my body. And even with the education that I had put myself in the rooms I was in, you can't predict what's going to happen. And it doesn't have to be surgical menopause. You add in anything, any of our aging process, we don't know how it's going to affect. And when we don't know, we often lead with fear. And when fear is in control, we're not making good decisions, and it makes us avoid, or it makes us hyper-focus on solutions. And none of that is going to help us have a foundation for a healthy sex life. And that's just the anatomical aspect of it. And again, I'm talking about Betty again, I'm so grateful that with her, I had a woman who was further down the aging timeline who kept saying, my sexuality matters and my sexuality isn't invisible just because I'm 80. And she was saying that until her last breath, basically. Mm-hmm. Having an aging mentor in who you are as a sexual being, and that gives you permission and hope and the modeling that our sexuality stays with us. If you're breathing, you are a sexual being. And that doesn't necessarily have to mean sexually active and doing sex acts with other, with yourself, other people, but it surely can. And with that representation of being sexually active, however that's defined, I think really does a number on us too.
Yeah. I'm so glad you brought up Betty Dodson. I've always found her to be a fascinating person, and I so wish I would have had a chance to meet her before she passed away. But for people listening who don't know who she is, many of you probably know her as the lady who encouraged women to grab a mirror and look at their vulvas. And, she was a cultural phenomenon for a long time. I mean, if you ever saw the movie Fried Green Tomatoes, there's this scene where Kathy Bates goes to a female empowerment workshop, and then she promptly leaves when the host hands out mirrors so they can look at their vulvas, but then she goes home and, pulls out the mirror and does it in private. But, it was a scene that was very much inspired by Betty's work. And, I think what Betty was doing was very revolutionary and helped so many people. And so, I was actually going to ask you about Betty and like how the lessons that she was teaching on getting comfortable and confident in your own body, like they're just as timely as ever, aren't they?
Oh, they are. And I mean, she was so ahead of her times in so many ways. And her work is going to be revolutionary for a very long time too, which says a whole lot about our sexual culture. One of the things that made Betty so special, not just because she was saying things that other people weren't, she'd give an opinion. Even if it was perhaps not the most politically correct or the most up to date, culturally, she gave you an opinion and you knew where you stood with her and you knew what her thoughts were. And even though she said it with like absolute definitiveness behind it, she was really a person of agency because she was always relational in how she was talking about the stances that she had, which was a really powerful reminder for me to know where I stood on something, but not be so rigid in that stance that I couldn't learn and grow and couldn't bring other people's opinions into the conversation and into our relationship, whether that's about self-pleasure, which she was like the queen of the Hitachi wand, or if she was saying, she's Austin would say in the circles, raise your hand if you have an STI. And then she would look at anyone that didn't raise their hand and be like, oh, I'm so sorry. and she, again, she loved being able to turn things upside down. And she would say, to the people who didn't have an STI, you just must not have had a very good sex life, which is a controversial thing to say. Right. And, whatever, we could dissect that in a different way. But what was so beautiful was her normalizing. She didn't normalize that you had to have all these sexual activities in order to be a legitimate sexual person. She just kept saying, well, what do you want? And she lived a life of curiosity, and she was so transparent. She would talk quite a bit about her labia were different sizes. And she said growing up in Kansas, where she didn't have a lot of conversations about sexuality, she thought it was her self-pleasure practice that had made one of them longer than the other. And it really affected how she connected with people for a long time until she understood that that was not the case. And she was saying, like in her 80s and 90s, she still had feelings and thoughts about feeling different, but now she knew how to talk about it and to work through it. People are going to have very different details than that, but I think everyone can relate to the experience of feeling that something about them sexually or something about their body feels at least in question. Is this like everybody else? This is, I'm sure you don't like this either. I don't love the word, is this normal? But that's often how it's posed. just wondering, and is who I am right or okay? And we can all answer the rest of that question with different details, but I think we all have them.
Yeah. And I think that speaks to how, so many of us feel so much discomfort in our own skin, and we have this uncomfortable relationship with our bodies. And we do have a tendency to blame ourselves for things that we don't like about our bodies in terms of also the way that they function. Like, for example, if you're somebody who finds it difficult to have an orgasm, or you reach orgasm too quickly or sooner than you would like, we have a tendency to try and blame ourselves and say, there must be something wrong with maybe the way I masturbated or whatnot, or
fantasies that I have, or I mean, the list is so long. And to me, I really position that in the blame of our sexual culture, that there's this right way to have sexuality and a wrong way. And we never have it the right way. Whoever it is that's saying it, it's not the right way. Wherever the fingers are pointed is the incorrect way. And we just know that's bullshit. And we know that's just absolutely inaccurate. And so it takes a lot of bravery to then sit there and say, that doesn't feel right for me. What does? And that in between of what doesn't feel right for me, or this isn't true for me, and that pause moment is so much potency waiting for you. It's where I wish we had our sex education. I wish that we were taught sexual agency every single year in so many different contexts. And I think our world would be so different if we understood how to build agency as the basis.
Yep. Amen. I mean, yes. And we're going to talk further about that in the next episode. We're going to dive into what we can do to build up our sexual agency and really embrace our holistic sexuality. So I look forward to continuing our conversation in the next show. Thank you so much for this amazing conversation, Juliana. I really appreciate having you here. Can you please tell my listeners where they can go to learn more about you and your work and get a copy of your new book?
Yes. And thank you for having me. And I love being a repeat with you too. It's wonderful to see you here. So I'm Dr. Juliana Hauser on all social media platforms. And my website is Dr.-Juliana. And on the website, we have a page that has all the links that you can choose where to buy your books online. So I'm only selling the books on online platforms, and Amazon and Barnes & Nobles are some of the bigger ones, but there's lots of options. I'm really excited to interact with people and to answer questions. And one of the things that I did to put my action behind that belief is that at the end of each chapter that has the 9 pillars, I have a QR code in it. And the QR code takes you to a place on the website that really goes into depth on each of the 9 pillars, but it also is giving stories from people. And because even though I'm sharing my stories and I have client stories that have given me permission to share, it's so important for me to have lots of diversity and for this to be an inclusive space. And I'm just one person. And so, I've only done what my life is, and I do not position myself as like the way to do sex. And so I'd love for people to tell their stories through this QR code and to read other people's stories so that we really can give lots of modeling for people as to, how does sensuality show up in their life? One of them is called connection. Like, what does connection mean to you? I would love for this to become a source of modeling if we can't even have it in our own life. And I went off of your question, sorry. But you can, I want you to buy the book, but I also want you more to put into your life and to add to the conversation. It's not just to receive. I'd love for you to add.
And I'll be sure to include links to all of that in the show notes. So thank you again so much for your time. I really appreciate having you here. Thank you for listening. To keep up with new episodes of this podcast, visit my website, Sex and Psychology, at sexandpsychology.com, or subscribe on your favorite platform, where I hope you'll take a moment to rate and review the show. If you listen on Apple Podcasts, please consider becoming a Sex and Psychology premium subscriber to enjoy ad-free listening for just $3.99 a month. You can also follow me on social media for daily sex research updates. I'm on Blue Sky and X at Justin Lehmiller and Instagram at Justin J. Lehmiller. Also, be sure to check out my book, Tell Me What You Want. Thanks again for listening. Until next time.